In the year 1552, one of the largest ships in the world at the time was traveling around the southern tip of Africa with over 600 people aboard. Before it made it though, several violent storms forced them to abandon ship off the coast of South Africa. The more than 500 survivors were then forced to make a brutal trek hundreds of miles to the nearest settlement. During this, they battled hunger, dehydration, and worst of all, the people they encountered along the way. And in the end, they never even made it to their destination. Instead, they ended up somewhere far, far worse. As always, viewer discretion is advised. The spice trade is one of the earliest and most significant trade routes in human history and is thought to date all the way back to the people of the Neolithic period of the 10th millennium BC. From that point and throughout the 1st millennium AD, spices that were plentiful in Asia didn't have terribly far reach because they were transported mostly by land to as far away as northern Africa. However, by the 15th century, transportation options were rapidly shifting. As a result of more efficient routes, spices start to spread further and further, and once they made it to Europe, demand for them was off the charts. Europeans marveled at what spices like cinnamon, cardamom, ginger, pepper, and nutmeg did to their food, and once they had a taste, they became insatiable. And at the time, spice traders could travel overland up through the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea before trekking through Arabia and Egypt to the Mediterranean. But this would change in the late 1400s when several Portuguese explorers discovered a route to the Indies around Africa. This discovery opened up a whole new world of trade, but unfortunately, it would be a violent one. As the Portuguese looked to get into the trade, they quickly found out that they had very few resources or riches that Indian and Arabian traders were interested in. This was a huge impediment to the country's involvement, but what they did have were better weapons and ships, so the Portuguese got themselves into the spice trade by force. The ships traveling through the Indian Ocean from other countries were far better at transporting cargo efficiently, but the Europeans were well versed in maritime warfare, making cargo ships no match for them. The Portuguese would then go on to overpower rival ships and lay siege to towns and villages in the Indies that resisted. By 1503, the country was sending warships by the dozen around the Cape of Good Hope on the southern tip of Africa on the way to the Indian Ocean. And despite what was a massive error that would need to be watched, a royal monopoly on the spice trade was issued by King Manuel I of Portugal, ushering in a period of Portuguese domination. As the next few decades passed, the Portuguese grew greedier and greedier and were constantly trying to engineer bigger and bigger ships that could transport more spices per trip. Because these bulky, heavy ships were difficult to properly navigate, however, many of them ended up at the bottom of the ocean as a result of the tumultuous weather that could be experienced near the Cape of Good Hope. But in any case, in 1550, a Lisbon shipyard was the site of the construction of a brand new galleon, which was a type of multi-deck ship used at the time for warfare, but midway through the build it was converted into a cargo ship for the purpose of hauling spices back from the Indies. This ship was dubbed the São João, which translates to St. John, and the ship served admirably in this role for the first 2 years in operation. In February of 1552, the final preparations were being made on the São João for another trip back to Portugal under the command of Captain Manuel de Sousa Sepulveda. And by 1552, Manuel was a revered military hero in Portuguese-controlled portions of India and an accomplished trader. He was said to have come from a good family and was such an esteemed figure in Portuguese maritime history that he was issued control of the spice trade between the island of Dui on India's western coast and his home country. On February 3rd, the São João was finally ready to depart the city of Cochin, which today is known as Kochi, and Manuel put the ship on a southwesterly course for Africa. Aboard the ship was a load of more than 1,300 tons of pepper, as well as various other spices, woods, medicines, and exotic goods. Additionally, the ship carried 600 people, which included Portuguese crewmen, passengers, and other people who were there against their will. Either way, this was an astounding capacity for ships at the time. Now, because of a raging war on the Malabar coast of India, there wasn't enough pepper available for the ship to carry a full load of it, but nevertheless, the São João was still sailing heavy as this allowed for more room for other cargo. In fact, even prior to leaving Cochin, some of the crew expressed concerns over the weight of the ship, which made it dangerous in storms and a target for pirates. But Manuel wouldn't hear of it, and the São João departed on time as instructed by its captain. And as is often the case in these stories, there was good reason for those on board to be leery of the weather, especially as the months would drag on during the voyage back to Portugal. Going back and forth from the Indies put ships right in the middle of a potentially dangerous set of weather circumstances. Particularly around the Cape of Good Hope, the region experiences strong winds and rough seas, especially during the winter. Captains sailing between India and Europe also had to carefully time their departures to account for the Indian Ocean monsoon season from May to September, when summer winds bring heavy rains. And although the Cape of Good Hope isn't directly affected by monsoons, carefully planning was crucial to avoid the worst of both the monsoon and the Cape's unpredictable storms. 2 months later, on April 13th, the São João crew spotted the coast of Africa for the first time on their return trip to Portugal, but the ship was already well behind schedule for several reasons. In addition to the heavy load it was carrying, the ship encountered some violent storms on its way toward Africa, which battered the ship and tore its sails. Unfortunately, these were the only sails on board, meaning they'd have to make do with them despite some of the damaged areas being little more than tatters flapping in the wind. While traveling along the coast of Natal in Africa, just southwest of Madagascar, the ship finally found some favorable winds, but they wouldn't last long. And although they were still technically within the dry monsoon season, they were close enough to the wet season for the conditions to start shifting, and they did so with little warning. Suddenly, the ship was facing headwinds blowing to the northeast when the ship was around 85 miles or 130 kilometers from the Cape of Good Hope. This soon led to controlling the ship to become unmanageable, and Manuel and his officers had a decision to make. They could either press on and push through the headwinds, or they could turn back to Cochin. If they turned back, this would allow them to fix the sails that were beaten up by previous storms, but this would also set them back an entire season because they'd have to wait until the return of the dry monsoon season weather. Ultimately, they went with a third option and simply turned the ship so that the strong headwinds became tailwinds. But no matter what they decided, it was too late. A new, more violent storm was brewing that was about to be heading right for them, and there was no chance to outrun it. This turn caused the ship to be battered by constantly shifting winds from both the east and west, and the turbulent seas were throwing so much water onto the ship that the threat of sinking was becoming all too real. Before long, the ship was in the midst of a severe thunderstorm, and maneuvering it was almost impossible. Because in addition to the ship's weight and the near destruction of the sails, it also had several disadvantages in these conditions. Throughout the early stages of the European spice trade, the French, English, and Dutch were focused on building ships that had greater stability, so their center of gravity sat much lower than that of the São João. These ships had a lower deck and forecastle while also having a longer keel, which is essentially the backbone of the ship. And by constructing the ships this way, they would be much easier to control when conditions grew nasty on the seas, no matter how heavy they were sailing. The Portuguese, however, were much more focused on building ships that could bring back massive amounts of cargo. So the larger Portuguese ships, like the São João, were longer and more narrow than those of their counterparts. They were also heavily gunned, which added more weight higher up in the ship's construction, and that made them more prone to rocking. And because these large waves that pounded the ship were coming in from each side, it created more damage to the already disabled galleon. In response to the amount of water that the ship was taking on, Manuel ordered the crew to start tossing some of the cargo overboard to lighten the load, but unfortunately what little they managed to throw over had little to no effect on the maneuverability. During the next 27 days, the ship and those aboard were tormented by successive storms, and the São João took a tremendous beating. And while in between these storms, stock was taken of the damage to the ship, and the news was awful. The mast, topsail, mainsail, and rudder were all beyond repair. In fact, the ship's carpenter reported that 3 of the pintles, which allow the rudder to swing side to side to steer the ship, were gone. And when he learned of this, Manuel ordered that this particular news be kept secret in fear that word getting out would cause morale aboard to crash. However, although this was kept secret, the damage aboard was obvious. Without many other options though, between storms, the crew set to work fixing what they could. Sails were sewn, a new mast and yard were made from what remained from the original ones, and there was even an attempt to fashion a makeshift rudder. But as soon as the next storm blew in, all of their efforts were obliterated by the ocean. By June 8th, the ship had gone almost nowhere since April, but luckily they managed to get far enough that the Natal coast was back in view. At the same time, the ship by then was almost useless, and time was getting dangerously close to when the weather would be at its worst. Manuel then made the decision to just let the ship drift with the current until they reached a depth of about 60 feet or 18 meters. Around this time, as the current brought the ship closer and closer to shore, Manuel ordered several of the crewmen to board one of the lifeboats and begin scouting the coast for a good place to beach the ship. After launching initially, all the crewmen could find were jagged rocks and large boulders that would smash the ship to pieces, but they eventually found one clearing north of the modern-day city of Port Edward. Upon their return, Manuel and the ship's pilot began trying to guide the ship in that direction, and once it was in about 42 feet or 13 meters of water, the captain ordered that the anchor be thrown. When the ship came to a stop, more crewmen were then sent ashore to tie off landlines. From there, the plan was to start ferrying those aboard to the safety of land, and once that was complete, they'd start to pull any and all supplies they could manage from the ship. Now, while it's maritime custom for the captain to be the last off a disabled or sinking ship, the very first to depart the São João were Manuel, his wife, and their children, along with 20 other crewmen who were to guard them on land from any curious locals. Once they were settled, the boat returned for another load of crew and passengers, and it made several successful trips in transporting them to shore. This wasn't really a fast and efficient process though, and it would take 3 days just to get a handful of people from the ship to the shore. Then on the third day, and after the third ferry returned to the ship for another load of passengers, the pilot, who was still on board, noticed that the landline had been severed, likely against these sharp coastal rocks, and the São João was now in serious trouble. Along with 40 other crew, the pilot then jumped into a lifeboat and made a beeline for the shore, only to smash against a boulder upon approaching the coast. All aboard that lifeboat made it to land unharmed, but for the 500 people still aboard the São João, this would not be the case. After the landlines broke, was now in serious trouble. Along with 40 other crew, the pilot then jumped into a lifeboat and made a beeline for the shore, only to smash against a boulder upon approaching the coast. All aboard that lifeboat made it to land unharmed, but for the 500 people still aboard the São João, this would not be the case. After the landlines broke, the anchor could no longer hold the ship in one place in these still turbulent waters. So just moments later, the ship split into almost 2 equal pieces after smashing against the rocks. This then forced those aboard to either jump into the water to attempt to swim to land or to cling onto the wreckage. Then, less than an hour later, the ship broke into 4 parts, sending everyone remaining in the water and all of the cargo floating into the sea. More than 100 crew, passengers, and the people that were held captive then lost their lives in the wreck, while more than 400 more managed to make their way to land to join the other 100 survivors that had been ferried there. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, the castaways were sort of in a state of shock. They had somehow survived a disabled ship in terrible weather conditions for almost 2 months, and now they were marooned in an unknown land. But in any case, as they began to process what had happened and the predicament they found themselves in, Manuel started formulating plans. He then ordered the crewmen to gather up any and all cargo and wreckage from the ship. He knew they'd be stuck there for a while, but he initially believed they could make a new boat out of what remained from the São João. This would be a type of vessel known as a carvo, which is a light sailing ship. 4 hours after the wreck, however, there wasn't a single piece of wood bigger than an arm's length on shore. There was just no chance they could build a ship with that type of wreckage. So next, Manuel set about the organizing and building of shelters using barrels and chests procured from the wreck. As this was going on, everyone who survived the sinking must have known that they were in a lot of trouble. There were by then 500 of them ashore with very few resources. They had very little drinking water and even less food, and not only that, they were in a territory known to be potentially hostile. But again, either way, they had to figure out a way to survive, and for the next 12 days, they lit large fires to keep warm and shared a small amount of flour that was salvaged from the ship. Thankfully, they would eventually locate a freshwater source for drinking, but staying on the coast wasn't going to be an option for very long. It's easy to think that staying put might be the best chance of survival because they could flag down any passing ships, but with July approaching, the number of boats sailing along the western African coast would be minimal at best. During the early portion of the nearly 2 weeks they spent on the coast, the 500 survivors weren't approached or harassed by any local people. In fact, they didn't see so much as a single person until one day some of the crewmen spotted a small group of locals that seemed to be leading a cow up on a hill. When they spotted the mass of people on the beach, the locals stopped and monitored them, but the Portuguese crewmen used arm and hand signals to call them over to the makeshift village they had constructed. After doing this for a few moments, the locals must have determined that it was safe to approach and started making their way to the beach. Manuel and 4 of the other crewmen then started heading toward them to meet them halfway, and once they met, the Portuguese used hand gestures to communicate. After a few exchanges, they were able to discern that the locals were interested in iron and they were willing to trade the cow for some. All the crewmen had, though, were iron nails left over from the wreckage of the São João. Manuel then left for a few moments and returned with 2 handfuls of nails for them to look over, and the locals seemed quite pleased with what they saw. Just as the deal was about to be made, though, more people appeared on the hill and began shouting in their native language to the others. And after hearing whatever the men on the hill said, the locals with the crewmen decided not to make the trade after all. This was obviously completely disheartening to the castaways, as the cow would have fed them all for a few days. On the 12th day of their time on the coast, things were getting desperate, and Manuel called together a council to decide what to do next. And after much debate, it was determined that the best possible course of action was to begin walking in the direction of a Portuguese settlement called Sofala, located along the Santo Espiritu River in what is today Mozambique. At a distance of around 800 miles or 1,280 kilometers, what they decided to do was no small feat, but they really didn't have any other options. Before they left, Manuel stood in front of the entire group of survivors to announce their plans and make a speech. And it was expected that he was going to provide some sort of inspiration to the group about what they had survived thus far and how they could continue to survive through the next chapter of the ordeal, but that's not what happened. In his speech, Manuel instead begged that the group never forsake him or leave him behind on their journey, essentially instructing the more able-bodied men to carry him should he ever reach a point of no longer being able to walk. It was obviously a bit of an odd thing to say and about all the captain had to offer the group before they embarked on such a dangerous mission. But in any case, on July 7th, the journey began. In the beginning stages, the group of 500 made decent progress at about 12 miles or 20 kilometers per day. And within their first month, it's believed that they traveled more than 365 or 590 kilometers, but that was about the only thing going for them. All they had to eat among them was a little bit of rice that was rationed out each day, and as they walked, drinking water became scarce. Soon both hunger and dehydration ravaged the group, and those who were too weakened by one, the other, or both were just left behind. And among the first the group deserted was a captive woman and her child who was supposedly the illegitimate son of Manuel. It would be days before word of the abandonment reached Manuel at the front of the group, and he was apparently devastated upon hearing the news. He then offered several of the men some money to backtrack and find them, but everyone he approached refused as they feared it would be a death mission. And that wasn't the only time Manuel offered money in exchange for undertaking dangerous pursuits. Their thirst was so great that he tried to enlist some of the crewmen to go find water, and for their troubles they'd received several gold pieces, but again, no one took him up on the offer. Before long, the group began to run into some local people, some of which were friendly and some of which were not. And soon enough, rarely did a day go by without the dwindling numbers in the company having to fend off attacks, during which many of them died. But incredibly, despite the ordeal of hunger, thirst, and the constant threat of violence, they made it to the Santo Espiritu River 4 months after departing the coast. They would now have to follow it to the Portuguese settlement. Along the way, they met a local king of a friendly tribe who welcomed them all into his community. And in fact, this actually wasn't the first time the tribe had encountered shipwreck survivors, particularly those from Portugal. So the king and many in the community learned some Portuguese as a result, allowing the two sides to communicate effectively. In speaking with the king, Manuel learned that the tribe was embroiled in a bitter war with a neighboring hostile tribe, so it wasn't safe for the group to continue on. So for a period of almost 2 weeks, the survivors joined the community and shelters were made for them and food and water were provided. Before long as well though, they became entangled in the conflict with the other tribe too. At one point, Manuel ordered his brother-in-law to take 20 of the men to join forces with the king's tribesmen for a campaign against the neighboring tribe. Upon his return, Manuel's brother-in-law advised that they should leave the community and continue on their trek to the Portuguese settlement. When the king learned of this potential plan, he met with Manuel and urged him not to go. The king knew that if the group encountered the neighboring tribe he was warring with, things would not go well for them. But unfortunately, no matter what argument the king tried to put up, Manuel was convinced by his brother-in-law's assessment of what to do next. And unfortunately, once his mind was made up, no one could convince him to stay. With no ill will toward the survivors, the king at the very least suggested that the group take a detour around the site of war, which would greatly add to the distance they'd have to walk, but would keep them safe in the process. But unfortunately again, even this wasn't appealing to Manuel, who wanted to reach Sofala as quickly as humanly possible, so he refused the king's offer of leading them around the known battlefields, and the group pressed on together. And sure enough, soon after departing the community, the survivors encountered a group of about 200 armed men from the neighboring tribe, just as the king foretold. Strangely, however, the tribe seemed friendly and even led Manuel to meet their own king. The king then eagerly accepted him and promised to build them shelters they could use for a few days, and when they were ready, he said he'd personally guide the group of survivors through their territory to the river. This offer, however, was not without conditions. If Manuel wanted the king's assistance and hospitality, the entire group of survivors would have to turn their muskets and swords over to him. The reason for this, the king argued, was that the weapons were frightening his people. Manuel's wife Leonor advised her husband against this, pointing out how bad of an idea it would be to disarm his group willingly in the presence of what was still unknown company. Just like the previous friendly king, however, Manuel didn't listen to the advice. So one by one, the group of survivors dropped their weapons off at the king's feet, and when the last of the muskets and swords had been collected, the king ordered his tribe to attack the survivors. Any of them who dared to fight back were killed, and those who surrendered were split into smaller groups and spread around the various villages in the area. And horrifyingly, Leonor was then viciously assaulted and stripped of her clothing. Afterward, to avoid the embarrassment of her servants seeing her naked, she dug a hole in the sand and buried herself in it up to her neck, refusing to leave under any circumstances. And true to her word, she remained in the hole until she passed from starvation. With his wife now dead and one of his children left behind long before, the thread that Manuel's sanity was holding on by snapped. He then aimlessly walked around the community they were trapped in for a few days before wandering into the African wilderness, never to be seen again. The rest of the survivors were then held captive by the hostile king and his people, and were forced to survive more hardships and horrible treatment. By early 1553, word had gotten around Portuguese ships that the São João never arrived back in Portugal, and an ivory merchant from the country commissioned a search party to locate them. It took some time, but eventually the search party happened upon the hostile people and the remaining survivors of the São João wreck. The leader of the party then negotiated with the king, and the two agreed that the Portuguese would pay 1 Spanish silver dollar for every one of the survivors' freedom. Sadly, the party brought far more money than they'd need. Among those in the original group of around 500 people, only about 25 were still alive. The freed survivors were then guided the rest away to Sofala, marking the end of their ordeal on May 25, 1553, more than a year after the São João first experienced weather trouble. It's thought that the wreck of the São João resulted in one of the first ever encounters between Europeans and South Africans, marking a significant milestone in recorded human history. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you want to listen to the audio-only version of these videos, you can listen where you even listen to podcasts. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a Patreon or becoming a member here on YouTube. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.